Hi, I'm Dr. Chad Larson. We've talked in past episodes about a significant health condition called metabolic syndrome. Metabolic syndrome is a set of certain clinical signs that have a really significant risk factor for developing cardiovascular disease, like coronary heart disease and strokes, just broadly cardiovascular disease. And the set of signs that lead to cardiovascular disease are high blood pressure, high blood sugar, high triglycerides, low HDL cholesterol, and a high waist circumference. So high in belly fat, basically. And so all you have to have is 3 out of the 5 of these clinical signs, and you have a significant risk factor for developing cardiovascular disease, the #1 killer in the US. And so it's very important to know if you fall into this category. And if you do, you are in actually a pretty huge subset of the population, because if you're an adult, there's a 1 in 3 chance that you have metabolic syndrome. Not in the future or a risk factor for developing metabolic syndrome, you have it right now. If you're an adult, 1 in 3 chance that you have metabolic syndrome. Either you or one of your friends or family members definitely have metabolic syndrome, because it's 1 out of 3. So it's a really significant condition. It is a major factor for developing death by one of these major common cardiovascular diseases. So it's really serious. And what hasn't been clearly understood is how to manage metabolic syndrome. What really is the driving factor in metabolic syndrome? And what has been kind of assumed is obesity. When a person is obese, they have a higher chance of having high blood pressure, of having high blood sugar, about having high triglycerides. Obviously, they're going to have a higher waist circumference, and usually low HDL or some combination of those things. But is it just obesity? Is it the body weight that's really the driving factor for metabolic syndrome? So as a clinician, we usually provide a treatment protocol that influences both body weight and other things like insulin resistance and other metabolic factors. And as a clinician, I kind of want all those things to change, but researchers like to really drill down to the individual variables and really find out what's the key driving factor. So I don't know if there's one key driving factor, but there's a really interesting study that sought to kind of unpack the whole process of metabolic syndrome. And they did something pretty interesting. This is a journal article that was published just a week ago in a journal called the Journal of Clinical Investigations. And it was out of, most of the researchers were out of Ohio State University, and is a really interesting, well done study. So basically what they did is they took adults who were obese and had metabolic syndrome, and they evaluated their metrics, kind of all those components that we just talked about, blood chemistry, and they evaluated fat content with both MRI and DEXA scans. So very sophisticated measurements to kind of test the before and after. And they wanted to basically look at 3 different diets. And the 3 different diets that they looked at was a high carb, sort of low fat diet, a medium carb diet, and a low carb, high fat diet. So they basically wanted to manipulate the carbohydrates in all 3 of these diets and then see how it changes these risk factor markers of metabolic syndrome. And so all of the subjects went through all of the diets. So they followed each diet for a month, and then they went through a washout period for 2 weeks, and then they switched over to the other diet. And then they did another 2-week washout, and then they did the 3rd diet. And they evaluated the metrics on, kind of before and after of all these changes of diet. So it's a very sophisticated study, very well done, but they're looking at something very, very specific. What they wanted to find out was, is weight loss a contributing factor or not? And so what they wanted to do is they constructed the diet very, very specifically so that there was actually no weight loss. They wanted them to maintain the exact same body weight throughout the study time. And they had to do some very specific dietary interventions in order to maintain body weight, because as they change these other macronutrient ratios, in some people, you have to balance that in such a way to make them maintain body weight. For example, we know that a low-carb diet oftentimes leads to weight loss, but they actually didn't want weight loss to happen because they're looking at something else, which I'll get to in just a moment. They wanted to maintain body weight, so even on a low-carb diet, they had to increase the calories to such a point where it caused the subjects to not actually lose any body weight. So what they did is they had these three groups, the high-carb, medium-carb, and low-carb diets, and they tracked them. And what they really wanted to investigate was the concept that what is really driving metabolic syndrome is processed carbohydrates go up, insulin goes up. When insulin goes up, then body fat storage is going to happen. And at the same time, when insulin is up, that blocks lipolysis, which is burning of fat, and therefore it blocks fatty acid oxidation, which is the utilization of fat as fuel. So insulin causes fat storage and then basically blocks fat burning. So insulin is kind of the gatekeeper in fuel partitioning. Are you burning fat or are you storing fat? And so they really wanted to specifically target carbohydrate consumption in the whole concept of metabolic syndrome. And they wanted to see, do they start to get some metabolic changes with any of these diets? And here's what they found out is they put it to the test, and they had the greatest degree of metabolic change. In other words, these risk factors for metabolic syndrome went down the greatest in the low carbohydrate, high fat diet. So here's what's interesting that they really made a strong point of, is that in the low carb, high fat diet, the subjects were consuming 2.5 times more saturated fat than in the high carb, low fat diet, but yet their triglycerides significantly went down and their degree of saturated fat in the plasma went down. Even though their dietary consumption of saturated fat was so much more, they actually had less saturated fat floating around in their system, and less in triglycerides. When they measured that in the blood test, went down significantly in the people that were following the low carb, high fat diet. So this low carb, high fat diet had the greatest amount of effect on metabolic syndrome. So it follows this process of what their hypothesis was, and then what they proved was that insulin is triggered mostly, it's triggered by other things, but it's triggered mostly by carbohydrates. So if you drop the carbohydrates, the insulin drops down. When the insulin drops down, the fat burning hormones turn on. When the fat burning hormones turn on, the body becomes more efficient at using fat for fuel, even though they consume significantly more fat. And they stuck to their research parameters in that they made sure that nobody lost weight. They wanted to specifically see if just these carbohydrate changes caused these risk factors for metabolic syndrome to go down. And by the end of each of the groups that were following the program, they did not lose weight on the program. The dietary adjustments were made in such a way where there was no weight loss. So it wasn't weight loss that led to the decreased risk factor for metabolic syndrome. it was clearly the change in carbohydrates affecting the degree of insulin. So once again, insulin really is the gatekeeper for risk factor for developing one of these chronic diseases, like metabolic syndrome, which of course leads to cardiovascular disease. So that's the take-home message. Hopefully you get the idea. It's a fantastic study. These researchers really did a good job at explaining it to us, and therefore I'm explaining it to you. So I will keep reading you the studies and bringing you the information. Until then, keep it real.